So these are your notes on the Middle Ages. So the first thing we need to understand is, when were the Middle Ages? The Middle Ages began around 500 AD. It's said to have really started from the fall of the Roman Empire, which, if you remember from last year's notes, the fall of the Roman Empire happened in 476 AD, so it was around the same time period. And then it went all the way up to the rise of the Ottoman Empire, or technically the Renaissance, which was 1500 AD. So it lasted about 1,000 years. And the Middle Ages would have been broken up into three distinct time periods, the longest of which lasted just over 500 years, and that was considered the early Middle Ages. That's the medieval time period that we think of the most. And then there's the High Middle Ages, which lasted approximately 300 years, and the Late Middle Ages was the shortest time period of approximately 150 years. And what these Middle Ages did was link the ancient civilizations that you learned about last year into more modern time periods. So it took the cultures of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and helped bridge that gap all the way up to the Renaissance. The Middle Ages are also known as medieval times or the Dark Ages. And they're called the Dark Ages because this was a time period when a lot of Roman culture and knowledge was lost. If you think back to the ancient civilizations and the units that you would have learned about, say, the Roman Empire, that was a time period when culture just flourished. There was so much trade from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and conquering other lands. Alexander the Great expanding an empire all across Europe and parts of Asia and into Africa. And then you had the Silk Road and trade that was going all the way into China, and they were bringing back all these new ideas and concepts and food and clothing and goods. So many things happened during those ancient civilization times that culture was flourishing. People were learning so much so quickly. And then during this time period, it all kind of seemed to completely pause, cease to exist. And so there wasn't a lot of advancement in any kind of technology or engineering. There wasn't a big focus on the arts, mostly because people were just struggling to survive financially, so they couldn't worry about painting or doing anything artistic. It was a select few that could. The Romans had kept really excellent records of everything that had happened during their empire, but during this time period there was no real central government, so nobody was recording events. So the types of homes that most people would have lived in were similar to this picture here. They were small 1 or 2 room homes. This was the general idea for most peasants, which was a large majority of the population. And these homes would have been made mostly of wood with these thatched roofs that kind of protected you from the elements, but not really. If it rained really hard, these roofs could wash out. In fact, that's where the expression "it's raining cats and dogs" came from, as it was often said that cats would curl up on these roofs and fall asleep, and if there came a large rainstorm, the cats would actually fall through the roof into the house because it would wash out. These homes would be really crowded. Entire families lived here, and families were not typically just 3 or 4 people. It could be 10 people living in this house and sleeping in this house in one room. The one room that was the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom, everything. But not just the people. They needed to keep their pets or their farm animals well taken care of, because these farm animals help provide for their food and their livelihood. And so if there was bad weather or it was really cold, the pets would come in too. So in a house like this, you might have 10 people sleeping and a cow and a goat and maybe some sheep. It would be very crowded, very smelly. Typically, it would be very dark as well. You didn't have electricity, and you certainly didn't want a lot of lanterns or candles because, well, look at the house. That would go up very quickly if somebody knocked over a candle. But you might have had a small fire going in the corner or just outside the house for food and possibly warmth. And that creates a lot of smoke in there. There's no chimney, there's not a lot of ventilation. As you can see in this picture, you can only see one window. There might have been one or two more windows, but that wasn't very common. And so smoke would fill up these houses fairly quickly. And smoke inhalation can be very dangerous. So that also caused a lot of illness and health problems for people, especially children. Now, this type of home was what was the norm for peasants, but people that were nobles or royals would have lived in large castles or large stone mansions, and they would have had definitely more space and more comforts. As far as clothing, the peasants would have worn very plain clothing made of a heavy wool, because again, sheep is something that was very common there, so that's what they would have had access to. And a heavy wool is not only going to be thicker and keep you warmer, but it's also going to be kind of scratchy material, more grainy, so it's not as comfortable. Now, heavy wool, when we think of it, we think how hot that would be to wear that. But in England, it doesn't get very hot. And so at this time period especially, it would have been even colder, and heavy wool wouldn't have been as miserable. Maybe in the summer months, it still would have gotten warm, like up into the 60s, and you wouldn't want to be wearing heavy wool, but it wouldn't be like we think of now, wearing heavy wool in 90-degree weather. The wealthy would wear much nicer clothing made from a finer wool, so a thinner, not quite as heavy, but also softer wool, or velvet, or even silk, which would have been traded along the Silk Road, the Silk Road coming from Rome and China. So that would have been just for the wealthiest of people. Men generally wear a tunic, which is like a really long, loose, flowing top or blouse, kind of like in this picture, with possibly wool stockings, thick pants, and boots, and a cloak. And women would have worn a long skirt, an apron, and a cloak. But there did exist at this time something called sumptuary laws, and these were laws that basically stated who could wear what types of clothing and what materials they could use. So while silk was expensive, yes, so only the royals and nobles had access to it, they also would have had laws against peasants being allowed to wear it. So peasants couldn't afford it, but nobles wouldn't even gift silk to peasants because it would have been illegal for a peasant to wear silk. Same with certain colors. Blues and purples were usually designated for royalty. So a peasant could not wear something that had been dyed with indigo dyes or blues and purples. Partially because that was the most expensive dyes, kind of like with the silk, but also those colors were used to signify whether or not somebody was a royal. So if a peasant was seen wearing those colors, it would be like they were trying to pretend to be royalty. And that was certainly illegal. And it is important to note, you might say, well, yeah, but everyone knows what the king or queen looks like, so they would know that that was just a peasant. No, this was before internet, and they didn't have TVs and cameras, and paintings wouldn't have been made readily available. So if you had never met the king or queen, you might have no idea what they look like. So if a peasant put on those colors and silk and was walking around, they could pretend to be royalty and possibly use that in a corrupt manner. So again, very illegal at the time. As far as school, not many people went to school. And the reason being was that you needed to, as children, help on the farm and help take care of the house. More people were worried about survival than they were about schooling at the time, because your job was to help make sure that your family and your home were cared for. Therefore, you could just learn all that from your parents. They're doing a fine job. They've kept you alive, so you can learn how to continue that job. There were some children who would learn a craft. Maybe you want to work in pottery, or you want to learn how to make clothing and textiles. Those kind of things, you would become an apprentice. So if you want to work with pottery, you're going to go basically live with somebody who's already a potter, and you're going to study them and learn from them for an extended period of time. Wealthy children might learn from tutors, and you would have somebody come out to the mansion or the castle, and they would live there with you often and be a private tutor. You'd have private schooling, and sometimes it was just for one single child or the kids in a family, but sometimes they would say, there's this many nobles that all live within a mile of each other, so let's set up our own little school inside one of the nobles' homes. Some of the schools were, instead of being run by just an average tutor, would be run by the church, because the church had a lot of power at this time, and it was actually growing even in more power. And at those schools, you would learn how to read and write in Latin, because that's what most texts were written in at the time. It's also important to note that during the Middle Ages, that's when the first universities that we know of began appearing. There had been schooling before, but nobody went off to basically college. You didn't go to major in something and say, I want to be a doctor, so I need to learn medicine. But you went to expand your education, and everyone would study the same types of things, but it could include reading and writing, logic, math, music, public speaking. There were a number of things you'd learn, but it was basically skills so that you would be more educated. Marriage. Typically in the nobility and the wealthier of people and in royalty, marriages were arranged. That means your parents would choose who you're going to marry, and you might not meet them until your wedding day. And this was typically done as a business arrangement. So if this family has a lot of money or they own a business that I need as a part of a business that I run, then I might work out a deal with them that, hey, if our two kids get married, that's going to be more lucrative for us. We're going to make more money off of this. It's kind of a trade deal. And so they would work these out. Peasants, however, didn't really have that luxury, if you'd call it that. They didn't have money to be used to trade. So typically you met your spouse working on a farm together. In order to be married, girls had to be at least 12 years old and boys had to be 14. And I know what you're thinking. Are you kidding me? But no. The life expectancy at this time was much younger as well, so it was more common. You weren't going to live to be 80 years old or so like people are now. You might live to be 35, which means that 12 and 14 is about a third of the way through your life. It's the equivalent of somebody being 25 now. So you could get married at a younger age. And women would bring with them what was called a dowry. Basically, part of your inheritance that you're supposed to get from your dad when he passes, he would go and take it and pay your husband. So if you're supposed to inherit $100, he's going to bring $100 to the wedding and sign it over to your husband as payment for marrying you. And sometimes it includes livestock or land. There's a number of things it could have included, but it was a payment for your marriage. No matter what happened to the marriage, the husband got to keep it. So if the female passed away, husband has the money. If he is abusive or abandons her, he decides to run away and leave the marriage, because divorce wasn't a thing, but abandon the marriage, he gets to keep the money. It was his payment for having married you. The weddings were actually very similar to how we have weddings today, except for it wasn't like white wedding dresses or anything like that. It was just you would put on nicer clothing, there would be a religious aspect to it, and your friends and family would gather. And again, divorce didn't really exist at the time, or wasn't real common at least, but it was super difficult to get because you were underage. And so children were considered mature enough and old enough to get married, but not mature enough and old enough to make a decision regarding divorce. So as I stated earlier, people did not have a lot of money, so they did not have access to many different types of food. Therefore, there wasn't a huge variety. If you were a peasant, you mostly ate bread and stew. And a stew would have been similar to these pictures here. It could have been beans, dried peas, cabbage, some other types of vegetables that grow in England. And if you were lucky, you'd be able to put a little bit of meat in there and bones. But not everyone had access to a lot of meat. If you only have one goat at the time period, you're going to use that goat for milk until you can no longer use it for milk. Then you can use it for food. But if you kill your one goat, now you no longer have milk. So meat was pretty rare, unless they used things like fish, which they had a little bit more access to. Things like cheese and eggs were usually saved for special occasions. Because those were a luxury, they were harder to come by. That would be something you'd celebrate. They did not have refrigerators. Remember, there's no electricity at the time. In some cases, they would have like ice boxes or ice chests, but it could only keep the food for so long. So if you had any leftover meat, you would have to smoke it and salt it to preserve it. So basically turn it into like a jerky. The nobles, however, did have a wider variety of food, and they could have desserts and sweets and different meats from hunting excursions because they had time for those activities and the money for those activities. As far as entertainment, the people of the time loved to have a good time whenever they could. They didn't have a lot of free time for things like that because, as I've said multiple times, it was all about survival and their livelihood. However, when they got a break, they liked a good party, and the nobles and royalty certainly did as well. So there would be tons of fairs and festivals and feasts that you could encounter at any of these events, and carnivals, all sorts of things to celebrate these special days. And special days and holidays usually coincided with the Christian calendar. So things like Easter, Christmas, various saints' days, all sorts of events. If it wasn't with the Christian calendar, there were a lot of pagan holidays as well. So depending on what religion you practice, that's the holidays you would celebrate. And the local villagers would all gather together. They would throw a huge party. Everyone would pitch in food and drink, and people would bring instruments and sing songs and dance. And it was just a chance for everyone to have fun together. As far as other entertainment, nobles especially really loved hunting. That was something they had the time for. They had horses, they had the weaponry, so they could do that as opposed to the peasants. And they would gather together in these large groups to go on a hunt on a local baron's land. So one of the local nobles would invite all the men over to his house that day. Sometimes the women would come too, but not for the hunt. The women would just gather inside the house together and, hang out, sip tea or, wine or whatever it might be, and just enjoy each other's company while the men went out on the hunt. And they would ride these horses with their trained dogs who would then go hunt down the prey, and it was a big spectacle. Sports, they had a few sports. There weren't a whole lot of games that we think of now, but they did have, they did have athletic events at festivals and other occasions. There was archery. I'm sure you've heard of jousting before or seen it in films where the two men on horses start at opposite ends of a track basically, and they come towards each other to fight by trying to knock the other one off of their horse. There was hammer throwing, wrestling. In some areas they had a version of kind of like a soccer, cricket, which is similar to baseball but not quite, bowling, or even golf. Music was a little different than we think of it nowadays. It kind of almost sounds like a whole lot of notes all at once, a jumble of notes. You would have a band that would play for the feast, and the bands would have things like pipes, which is more like flutes. You could have drums, fiddles, harps, bagpipes, and even an instrument called a hurdy-gurdy, which I'm going to show you exactly what that sounds like. So this is a man playing a hurdy-gurdy. And while that may not have sounded like much to you, that man was very talented at what he was doing. Troubadours were one of the most popular forms of entertainment. Those are groups of men who would travel from town to town singing and playing music. It was like their own little concert tour, right? And so they would go around and they would tell these romantic stories about knights and heroes and put on plays and sing songs and recite poetry and possibly paint pictures, but they were all about the arts. This picture up here is supposed to be a group of troubadours. And they could even get very famous depending on how good they did at their job. And so they might be invited specifically to play for royalty. And then people did like to play games. One of the popular games among nobility was chess. But they also had different games with dice. They had blind man's bluff. They'd play checkers, go on horse races, or just play with cards. Now, let's move on to some of the important people of the Middle Ages. And we're going to kind of breeze through these just to give you a basic idea of who they are. The first very important person, or VIP, is Charlemagne. I know that's kind of an odd spelling, but it's pronounced Charlemagne. He was the king of the Franks, which is a Germanic tribe that really helped settle what is modern-day France. And he actually became the Holy Roman Emperor. So he lived from about 742 to 814 in Belgium and Germany area of Europe. His name literally translates into Charles the Great. It's like Charlotte is supposed to be Charles, and then it's like Magna or magnificent, right? So Charlemagne is Charles the Great. His dad was a king, and he left his whole empire to his two sons, but very quickly Charlemagne's brother died as well. So Charlemagne lost his dad and his brother in a short time period, and he took over. And he started expanding the Frankish Empire. He conquered much of Germany, parts of Italy, and Spain. So he became what people say is the founding father of French and German monarchies. So a lot of French and German royalty, especially throughout the Renaissance, could trace their heritage and their lineage back to him. And now a lot of genealogists, because he's considered this father of several great nations, a lot of genealogists will find it a big point if they can say they trace their lineage back to Charlemagne. They trace their family tree all the way back to Charlemagne, which, fun fact, just see if people actually listen to this video. I've done my family tree, and I am a descendant of Charlemagne as well. So I am one of those people that can say I traced my lineage all the way back to Charlemagne. So Charlemagne then becomes what's called the Holy Roman Emperor, which is kind of an interesting job title, basically. He was crowned this on Christmas Day in 800 CE, which is the same as AD. It just depends on, who's writing it, AD or CE. But Pope Leo III gave him this title, and he had no official power. So he's not actually like a king or anything like that. He's not an emperor. But it was considered this title of great respect. Everyone trusted and respected the Pope. So for him to crown somebody and say, "You are the Holy Roman Emperor," he cannot pass laws, but people are bowing down to him as somebody who should be trusted and listened to. He was considered a very strong leader, a good administrator, good at what he was doing, and he started having the laws written down and recorded because he was noticing that people were becoming, especially royalty, becoming very corrupt and were making decisions. The expression would be like willy-nilly, just, that one's punishable, but that one's not. And let's punish this today, but not tomorrow. And he said, no, we need the laws written down so that everyone can see them, or at least those that could read. And then we're going to enforce what we write down. You can't change the law tomorrow. And a big thing he pushed was education. He really thought it was important that people go to school and learn how to read and write and further their own education. So he set up all these schools and monasteries, which is where, monks live and parts of the Catholic Church. But what's interesting is he himself was illiterate. He could not read or write, but he wanted to make sure that other people could. William of Normandy was King of England from 1066 to 1087 AD, and he lived in Normandy, France, which is the very northern tip of France. If you know your World War II history and they talk about D-Day invasion, that happened in Normandy, France. And he lived to be almost 60 years old, but he led the Norman conquest of England. So he was often called William the Conqueror. He left from Normandy and conquered England. His dad was a duke, which is not a king, but typically a duke is somebody who is related to the king or of high noble status. A duke is going to be very, very close with the king and sometimes almost like an advisor. So his dad had a high royal position, high nobility position. His mom was not noble at all. And so he grew up and was raised as, you will be the future Duke of Normandy. When your dad passes, this title is passed on to you. And that actually being a duke puts you in a line of succession for the throne. So he ended up becoming Duke of Normandy at a very young age when his dad died in 1035. So if you do the math, he was about 7 years old when he became the Duke. And a lot of people challenged his right to rule as Duke. They thought he was too young, he shouldn't be able to be a Duke. And they even went after and tried to kill him. And it says he fought many battles to defend his title, but really he would have had an army and people helping him fight, because as a 7-year-old, he was not going to war. So when the King of England, known as Edward the Confessor, died in 1066, William claimed that Edward had promised him the crown because they were related. They were some sort of cousins, right? And he says, oh, now I'm supposed to become king now that he has died, because he told me on his deathbed that he wanted me to be the new King of England. But the people of England wanted someone named Harold to be king. They did not want William of Normandy to become king. And so they kind of schemed behind his back, and they crowned somebody king before William of Normandy could be crowned. Literally, King Edward had been dead for 1 day before they crowned this man. So the King of Norway then invades England because he decides he also wants the crown. And he sees that there is a weakness, that people are divided in England. They cannot figure out who their leader is. And if they can't figure out who their leader is, they're weakened, there's chaos. Now is the time to go for the crown. And so King Harold II went out to meet him in battle. And William saw this as an opportunity. And again, just like the King of Norway did, he was like, I see a weakened front now. Now King Harold II is going to have to battle 2 people at once, which is going to be exhausting. He's going to exhaust his resources, and he's not going to be able to win both. So after his battle with Norway, King Harold turns around and he has to face William. And William has a much stronger army because his army has not just fought a huge battle. So they fight this battle called the Battle of Hastings, and in this battle, King Harold II was killed by an arrow. So William then eventually conquers the city of London. That's how he gets William the Conqueror. So on Christmas Day, 1066, he becomes the official King of England. And he spent the first several years of his reign basically putting down revolts. Remember, the people of England had crowned somebody else. They did not want him there. And so people were rioting in the streets. They were trying to attack the castle left and right. And he needed to put a stop to that. So he created this thing called the Herring of the North. And basically, he went scorched earth on them. He ordered much of the countryside to be destroyed. If you don't like me, fine. I'll burn down your house. I'll burn down your fields. I'll make sure that you have nothing left. You will learn to respect me. You will learn to listen to me because you have nothing else to do. And this whole policy actually caused the death of at least 100,000 people. They don't know how many for sure because remember, records were not very meticulous at the time. He's also known for building several castles during his reign, and the White Tower as part of the Tower of London. And it's called the Domesday Book, but it's basically a full record of everyone's possessions. So going around and kind of doing like a census, not just finding out who lives at each house, but also what do they own and how much do they own of everything and what is their taxed value. And he eventually died in battle. All right, Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was a military leader, which, if you know anything about your history of the time, would have been pretty unheard of for a female to be a military leader. But she lived in France. You'll notice she did not even live to be 20 years old. But she led the French against the English in the 100 Years' War. And she started this obviously at a very young age. So she was not wealthy. She was not from royalty. She was a fairly average girl who grew up on a farm in a very religious family. And she had studied the Word of God, she had prayed, and she had worked hard. And at the age of 12, she has a vision that Michael the Archangel came and told her that she was going to lead the French in a battle against the English and take the king to be crowned at Reims, right? So she is going to make sure that the French help take over parts of England and become the rightful rulers. And she had had these visions and heard voices for several years. And if you could imagine at this time, a 12-year-old girl running around saying she's hearing voices in her head, that an angel told her this was going to happen, and that she saw an angel and he prophesied that this was going to happen. Most people thought that she had a mental illness, that she was crazy, that something was wrong with her, and they were ignoring her and they were making fun of her. But finally, at the age of 16, she decides she's going to take action. She's going to listen to these voices and do something about them. So she goes to the king and she asks for an army. She says, I have to go fight for this cause. And he tells her, no, you're a 16-year-old girl. Why would I give you a whole army to go fight another battle against an army of men? But she refused to give up. She felt like this was her calling. This is what she was supposed to do. So she kept pestering and pestering until finally the king gave her a very small army to travel with and go into a small battle. And when she traveled, she did not want to be seen as a target because, again, women were not supposed to be out there fighting. So she cut her hair very short. She would dress like a man, and she would try and blend in as a man. And while she waited for the king to give her this army, she practiced for battle. And she had become a very proficient fighter. She was an expert horse rider. She knew what she was doing and she was prepared. Which leads us to the Siege of Orleans. And the French people believed that she was sent from God to save them from the English. They had been at war against the English for quite a while in this 100 Years' War. And she got wounded in battle. She rides into battle bravely with so much courage and valor, and she's wounded, and she continues to fight despite the wound. She's not going to give up. And she ends up winning a great victory, basically made it so that the French could not be conquered by the English, and it made sure that the French king, King Charles, was to be crowned as the king, thus fulfilling her visions that she had had, that the angel had told her was going to happen. Her visions finally came true with the siege of Orleans. However, it did not end well for her, as you can tell. So she's helping out in this small town, and she is captured and sold to the English. The English are not happy with her because of everything she has done, and so they held her as a prisoner, and they put her on trial, and they wanted to prove that she was a religious heretic. And if you don't know much about heresy or a heretic, that's somebody who goes against the commonly held belief at this time, which would have been the religion. So they're basically saying that she has been spreading false information about the church, that her visions then would be going against God. And so they want to put her on trial for that. They cannot find any proof that she has broken any religious laws. She is not a heretic, but they are out for blood. They want to make sure she's punished. So instead, they find her guilty of dressing as a man, which she admits she 100% did. It was for her own safety in battle, and that was a crime, typically not one that was that severe. However, because they were out for blood, they gave her the death penalty because she dressed like a man in battle. And her death, she was burned alive at the stake. So the way they would have done this, they would have tied her to a stake in front of the whole town or anyone that came out to town square, and set the logs underneath her on fire. And then it would be a pretty agonizing death because it would heat up around you. They say often your skin would start to blister and melt, and it would be agonizing. Most people before they died would just pass out from shock and pain. But before she is burned alive, she asks for a cross, and an English soldier then gave her a small wooden cross that she could hold on to while she was being burned alive, thus also proving to them that she was not against Christianity, not against the religion. And witnesses said that some of the last words she said was that she was forgiving them for what they were doing to her, and she asked them to pray for her. So some of her last words were saying, I forgive you for killing me. I forgive you for what you're doing here. I just ask that you pray for me. Pray for what's about to happen to me. And she was only 19 when this happened. So her strength and courage throughout this whole thing is just remarkable. So what ends up happening is that the Catholic Church in 1920 made her a saint, and somebody who basically dies for their cause. So then we have the Magna Carta. This is a super important event of the time period. King John of England became king in 1199, and he was incredibly cruel, not very well liked at all. He would tax people very heavily, just for his own gain. He wanted to be rich, he was greedy, he would torture people, and even the nobles and the barons were saying, whoa, this guy needs to be checked. He's not even helping us anymore. And they were not used to that because nobles always got pampered and taken care of by the king. So the fact that he's hurting them upset them. So they started this group that they called the Army of God. And King John goes and meets with all the barons on June 15th, 1215. And the Council of 25 barons came together, and they eventually became known as the Parliament of England, which they still have Parliament in England. It's similar to our Congress. And they draw up this document called the Magna Carta, which they force him to sign. But in essence, I mean, it's a very important document, but if you boil it down, it's basically stating that the king is not above the law of the land, and he has to protect the rights of the people. So the Magna Carta will be the law of the land, and he is going to have to follow it. His job as king is to take care of the people, not take care of himself. And it's establishing this idea that the government is for the people. So it protected church rights, it gave people swift justice, because at the time you could steal a loaf of bread and be put in prison for years before your court date and then get your punishment. And so, I mean, if the punishment was supposed to be a month in prison, but you just spent 5 years in prison waiting for court, it wasn't fair. So it was like they had access to courts at a reasonable rate. They couldn't have new taxes imposed without the nobles getting together and agreeing on it. Basically, you couldn't overtax people. You could tax them, but it had to be a fair tax. You couldn't just imprison people for the sake of it. And the council says they're going to make sure that King John follows all these laws, and in return, they will give back London, because when they had rebelled, they had taken over parts of London. So, basically, in the end, neither signed party upheld their end, but this document in itself, while it's considered a failed document because nobody actually upheld their end, is very well known because it influenced the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and the idea that this is the supreme law of the land, and that the government's entire job is to take care of the people and provide for the people, not provide just for the leader, and that royalty has to follow the laws as well. So again, this document influenced our own government. Magna Carta is a Latin word meaning great charter, and so it was originally written all in Latin, and it's considered one of the most important documents in the history of all democracy. So we are on to our last slide. You've made it. This has been a lot of notes, I know, but these are just some fun facts about the Middle Ages. So, people ate bread. I told you about that with the food. But the bread eaten by the people in the Middle Ages was usually really gritty because they had to grind the grain themselves, and they used millstones and rocks to do that. And sometimes the millstones would break off. And so people had kind of like nubs for teeth. It would wear down your teeth really quickly because you were basically chewing on rocks at times. Peasants were never allowed to hunt on the Lord's land. The Lord is the person they basically pay their taxes to. And so if you were a peasant and you killed a deer on your Lord's land, which technically is your own backyard, but you're renting that space, your punishment could be death. As far as medicine, very primitive at the time. They didn't know a whole lot about human anatomy. And so one of the most common cures of the time, there were some herbal cures, but a very common one was to bleed people by putting leeches on their skin. So if you had, say, the flu or flu-like symptoms or a bad cold, the idea was it was your blood that was infected, and if you lost that infected blood, you would be cured or healed. And so they might put leeches on you to draw out the infection, or in some cases, again, they didn't know a whole lot about anatomy. They didn't know how wrong this was. They would actually cut your wrists and let you bleed out over a bucket. And the hope was they would stop the bleeding once they felt like the infection had stopped. But as many of you know, the wrist is a very dangerous spot. It's harder to stop the bleeding because of major arteries that run through there. And so a doctor would think they're curing you of a cold, and instead you would end up dying within minutes from their cure. Most people of the time drank ale or wine, so basically beer and wine or alcoholic things. They did not drink much water. And I know that seems very confusing because we think of water as far healthier than beer or wine, but they didn't have a way to filter and purify the water. So the only place they could get the water was from the rivers, and the river was also their sewage drainage. So you were likely to get horrible diseases from the river if you drank that water. Also, We talked about troubadours. Sometimes they would have an assistant called a jongleur, and this person would add in like acrobatics and juggling to the show. It would be like the court jester. A lot of the most popular stories of the time were ones about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. People who dressed up and disguised themselves at festivals were called mummers. Just a fun little word for you. The medieval version of football, or kind of like soccer, was called game ball. And they didn't really have any rules other than you had 2 teams, 2 goals, 1 ball. Get it in there, doesn't matter how you do it. And the last little fact here, I've got a video that goes with it, but one of the most popular festivals was called May Day, and that festival was used to celebrate the arrival of summer. May Day is still on our calendars now, usually celebrated on May 1st. And for this festival, people would dance around maypoles. They would have large bonfires, and usually there would be a girl crowned as the Queen of the May. But a maypole would be a pole with ribbons coming off of it, and there was a special dance that you could do, and it would basically wrap the ribbons around the pole to create this neat design, and you would intertwine and work together. So this is the end of the notes, and now it's going to cut to a video of a maypole festival and dance, and that will end out our notes.